Hello everyone, and welcome to an episode of Fit Till 30. As always, I am your host Tudor, and thank you for joining me on each Wednesday for a new episode of this show. This week, I thought I would go into a bit more detail about what metabolism means. So we discussed in previous episodes a bit about metabolism, how important it is for determining how many calories you should set for yourself when you're going through a weight loss journey. But I think I did not actually go into greater detail on just how exactly determine some things about the metabolism. So I would like to start with an introduction about what metabolism actually is. So metabolism is an umbrella term to describe all the processes that are biochemical in nature that your body goes through every day to process all the food that you're eating into useful energy for your body. Now, whilst we usually refer to the metabolism as a whole, there are actually three components that are involved in it. Namely, these are the resting metabolic rate, the thermal effect of food, and the active energy expenditure. I will now proceed to basically explain all three of these in a bit more detail. The first one, the resting metabolic rate, is the energy that you require on a daily basis just to survive. Therefore, you could equate this to if you literally did nothing in a day, not even eat or move and just stay in bed all day, then most likely all the calories that you need in a day are equal to this resting metabolic rate, hence the name. This one will almost always equate to about 2/3 of what you actually need in a day for most people, because most people will move during the day usually. Now, the idea of the resting metabolic rate is that it's mostly something that you can never remove from the equation, so to speak, but it can be influenced by quite a few factors. Chief among them are things like height, right? So things like someone that is of a higher height than someone else will usually have a higher resting metabolic rate, because that usually means that they have a larger body and they consume more calories. Same thing goes with weight, because again, higher weight, bigger body, so more calories to maintain on a daily basis. Another small factor is gender. So for example, on average, a woman will have about 3% less calories to consume in a day than a man, if we base it just on the resting metabolic rate. Another thing that happens is that obviously your body has a lot of organs that it needs to maintain every day, chief among them being things like the heart, brain, kidneys, liver, and also your muscles. These are also parts of your body that need to be maintained on a daily basis, hence why people that build more muscle will also consume more calories than someone who doesn't have as many muscles. The other thing is basically what I described before was the fat-free mass. There's also the fat mass itself, which obviously for people that are overweight is also an important actually source of calorie expenditure on a daily basis. So you can imagine this as being something like so two people that are very similar in height, weight, and so on, but one of them is a lot more overweight than the other one, will have more calories consumed each day. Of course, the fat mass is not as much of a energy consumer as, for example, the muscles are. So that's why two people of the same weight, but one of them has less fat than the other, will probably consume more calories in a day. Now, the other one that I wanted to reach is age. So perhaps this is a surprise to many, but basically once you reach your 20s, that's pretty much the peak of your resting metabolic rate, so to speak. So after your 20s, you'll basically see each decade that you will lose about 1-2% of your resting metabolic rate. This is because basically there are a lot of hormones and other substances that you will produce more in your youth, but which will start to decline with age. And there's also a bit of a decline in the activity of certain cells in your body, which is really out of the scope of this conversation. Now, moving on to the next big category, so to speak, namely the thermic effect of food. This is actually something that when I learned was a bit surprising for myself as well, but makes a lot of sense when you think about it more, is the fact that basically food that you ingest needs to be processed. So that means that even though obviously pretty much any food that you will eat will have a net positive aspect, so to speak, you will notice that a certain percentage of the calories that you ingest will actually be used to process those said calories. It is a varying amount based on the macronutrients. I'm referring to proteins, carbs, and fats. But the average accepted thing is that about 10% of the calories that you consume will be burned because of this thermal effect of food. Now, the third category, which is the activity energy expenditure, is basically just a fancy term to describe all of the activity that you're going to do during a day. So this can be broken down basically into two, let's say, broader categories. You have physical activity, which basically describes any kind of exercise that you're doing intentionally. And you also have the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, a long word, I know, but this is usually referred to as NEAT, which is a lot more helpful. And NEAT basically describes most of the activity that we do in a day, but that isn't necessarily intentional in nature. So that may be things like all of the moving that we do as part of our job, all of the moving, from one place to another, part of your commute, or things like, doing chores around the house. So all of these activities that do mean that you're moving around, but you're not necessarily doing it as part of some exercise or fitness procedure. So physical activity obviously is more on the burning side of calories, let's say, compared to NEAT. But because in practice, all of us who are not athletes and therefore don't have a lot of time for training can discover that just physical activity is not going to contribute a lot of calories per day, because it'll be something like, let's say, half an hour or an hour per day, which only equates to like 5% at most of what you're doing during a day. But on the other hand, NEAT actually does account for a lot of calories if you think about it, depending on your level of activity during the day. So if you've ever tried, for example, to fill in one of those metabolism calculators, one of the questions that you will be asked is, how active are you during the day? And that's why they're posing that question, so they can have an idea of how high your NEAT levels are. So for people that have, for example, very strenuous physical jobs, NEAT will actually account for a lot of calories during the day and drastically alter, let's say, the balance of how many calories they do need during the day. And I think that's always something that's worth noting, because I think that's something that people gloss over when they think about ways to improve their weight loss. Now, of course, one thing to keep in mind is that even when you take into account all of these factors, there is still a small degree of uncertainty, let's say even to this day, when calculating basal metabolic rates and in general the idea of what makes up your daily metabolism. So unless you will go, for example, to a specialist and there are some tests that can be done to actually measure your metabolic rate in a professional way, there is no guarantee that the metabolic rate that you are calculating by yourself would be 100% accurate. And in fact, research has shown that when estimating this metabolic rate and then actually doing the test to determine the actual number, there are variations even for people that should otherwise have identical results of about 10-15%. So always do keep this in mind as well, that even if you find what you think is the best calculator on the internet for your metabolic rate, unless you actually go to a specialist and do the necessary measurements for an entire day, there will still be perceivable differences. So that's why it's very important when you're trying to calculate how many calories are you going to eat to achieve weight loss. You have to be prepared to do slight adjustments to this number from one week to another based on how well or how badly your weight loss journey is going. Moving on to discussing about this week's weight loss progress, I am happy to report that this week I have went from 123.7 kilograms to 122.5 kilograms. So that is basically a weight loss of about 1.2 kilograms. So once again, it is quite nice progress, I feel. It still fits the model of being around 1% of my total weight. And the BMI is starting to decrease quite well. Again, we have a long journey ahead of us if we want to at least reach an overweight categorization instead of obese, but progress is progress, right? So that's why I set up this goal as being 1 year long, because realistically, that's how long this should take. Now, when it comes to the eating habits for this week, I still think there could be improvements realistically. Like, I've still had opportunities, so to speak, this week where I ate a bit too late for my liking. I also did a lot of movement, to be fair. I even went hiking in the weekend, and I think that helped a lot because in that day I actually did not eat too much, and that's an interesting habit that I observed for myself when it comes to fitness, in the sense that days where I do a lot of exercise actually are days where I don't eat that much, because I tend to not eat whilst on trails, for example, because it simply usually means that I'm going to have a bad time, so to speak. So I prefer not to eat during exercise, and this obviously helps with weight loss. Now, of course, I've tried not to eat too much after finishing the trail, but that wasn't really possible because I was with other people as well and kind of got encouraged to eat perhaps a bit more than I should have. And that actually also was a good sign that I felt a little bit uncomfortable eating much, which is quite an improvement from my usual eating habits where I'm not really influenced by, let's say, the size of the portion, or simply put, just how much food I can put into me, basically. So I'm quite glad that now, as I'm going through this journey, I'm starting to have a more balanced approach when it comes to food and how much to eat, and not always having to clean my plate and so on. So I'm really glad that I'm starting to see some differences, not just in my, let's say, conscious behavior, but also in what my body also sees as healthy eating habits. So there you have it. This week again is a bit of a success, and I'm glad that we're going strong still. So thank you everyone for listening to this episode, and I hope to see you next week as well. Have a nice day, and goodbye.